I'll start off by telling you about a road rage incident that you may have seen on television. It happened in Southern California very recently. A mother was driving. Her son was in the back seat, 6 years old, in a bumper seat. And a car came along, and the mother apparently cut the car off. Or actually, that's not quite correct. The car cut the mother off. And the mother was so incensed that she made a hand gesture, an obscene hand gesture at the driver of the other car. And that made the driver of the other car incensed that he was being belittled. And so he told his girlfriend who was driving to slide in behind the mother's car. And then he took out a gun and shot one bullet at the trunk of the car. The bullet went into the trunk and through the back seat and killed the mother's son, who was 6 years old. His name was Aiden. The bullet went into his abdomen and it was a fatal shot. He was on his way to kindergarten. It took a couple of weeks, but the police were able to find the shooter, because the car, which was a white Volkswagen Golf Sportswagen, was relatively rare, and that helped investigators track them down, and they were recently arrested. Now, and paying attention to that article, we see two people who could have prevented the killing of the little boy. First of all, the boy's mother. When her car was cut off, she didn't have time or the inclination or the intelligence not to react offensively and give a hand gesture that offended the other persons. She didn't keep her cool. She just got so mad, she flashed him an obscene sign, and then he in turn couldn't keep his cool when that happened, and didn't allow any space between the stimulus and the response. His response was just to shoot, and he wasn't trying to kill the child, but that's what happened. So how do you go about avoiding a short fuse like that and choosing well? Because we all, at times, have to think about what we're going to do between the negative events that happen and the results that we want. Well, first thing you can do is observe what is happening within you. Observe rather than becoming what is happening to you. That's the best way to cope. And that's not always easy to do, and it takes some practice. So something bad happens, and you just observe how you're feeling inside rather than becoming that. By observing, you free up your will to use your ability to choose, to utilize your power of choice. That's what observing allows you to do. It allows you to utilize your power of choice by freeing up your will. As, for example, when you're cut off in traffic, as a mother was, it's a near miss, and you observe that you feel rage, but you don't choose to act on it. You don't choose to become enraged. by acting on your feeling. You're making good use then of the space between the event and the response, between the stimulus and the response, when you choose to observe rather than becoming what is happening to you. And then, after that, you can use some positive self-talk to counteract the negative feeling of rage. Because good self-talk can neutralize negative experiences. For example, the mother might have said, "I'm so lucky that our cars didn't collide. We are all alive and well, that's great, and I can still enjoy my day." And her son would have been still alive. I'll tell you about the most amazing incident that I've ever heard of where a person made the most difficult choice. It happened in 1939, and it was the most difficult choice I've ever heard of, was made by the man who was living in Warsaw at the time in the Jewish section. And when the attacking German army reached his street, the Nazis lined up people against a wall and shot them. And those people included this man's wife, his 2 daughters, and their 3 little boys. Although the man begged to die with them, the Germans refused to shoot because the man spoke 5 languages and he could prove very useful to them in a prisoner of war camp or any kind of work camp where they had different nationalities. So right after his whole family died in front of him, he made a choice. And as he related in the book, Return from Tomorrow, he said this, and I'm going to quote him. Quote, "I had to decide right then whether to let myself hate the soldiers who had just shot my family. It was an easy decision, really. I was a lawyer. In my law practice, I had seen too often what hate could do. What hate could do to people's minds and bodies in the courtroom, and hate had just killed the 6 people who mattered most to me in the whole world. I decided then that I would spend the rest of my life, whether it was a few days or many years, loving every person I came in contact with." End of quote. The aftermath of that is that for the next 6 years, he went about his prison camp helping other prisoners, preaching love and forgiveness. And when the camp was liberated at the end of the war, a newspaper reporter noticed that he alone, among all the prisoners, stood erect and seemed to be in decent shape. The reporter assumed that he must have been in that hellhole of a prison camp only a short time. But no, he had been there the longest, and he had suffered the same starvation diet and slept in the same disease-ridden barracks as all the other prisoners. But he had held up much better, both physically and mentally, than all the others. Was that due to the choice he made 6 years before to refuse to hate people and live with an attitude based on love? I think that had a lot to do with it. We can't manage what we aren't aware of. And often, I think it happens very often that we don't notice what triggers our impulses to react. Most often, we will notice the results of the trigger, that is, the sensations at our body, mind, and feeling level, such as increased heart rate or red face, anger, upset, racing thoughts, such as, how dare they, or this is terrible. Now, this describes an emotionally reactive state, and that can be very destructive. In this state, a person is least human, least moral, least evolved, not in control of himself or herself. I'll talk about different levels of competence in controlling your reactions, in utilizing your power of choice, in controlling the space between your events in your life and your feelings, between a stimulus and your response. Here are 4 levels of competence. The first one is called unconscious incompetence. That means that you've got no control because you're not even aware that there's a space between stimulus and a response, let alone that you have any power to control what happens there. Most children and tweens are here in level 1, unconscious incompetence. They just don't know. They're not mature enough. And therefore, they're likely to react to any negative stimulus, like an insult, with some kind of negative response. For example, a feeling of pain or lashing back at the person who insulted them, because they don't know that there's a space between hearing the insult and their reaction, a space that they can enlarge, but they just don't know that that the space exists, and so they have no control over it. That's unconscious incompetence. The second level is conscious incompetence. Now you're aware that you've got the power to choose. You're aware of it, but there's no action. You're aware that you should do something, whatever it is, fill in the space. Or you're aware that you should not do something, again, fill in the space, but you just don't do it. And examples, you could say, I know I should exercise, but, and then you have an excuse. Or, I know I shouldn't take things that will harm me, but, and then you have an excuse. Many teenagers and adults are on this level. They know what they should do, but that is, they're conscious of it, but it's called conscious incompetence because they don't take any action. They don't do anything about it. They don't use their power of choice. They just react. And that's conscious incompetence. And of that, the philosopher Lao Tzu says, to know and not to act is not to know. The next level is called conscious competence. Now we become aware and we also act, and that takes some effort. But that's wonderful. Congratulations. You've got what it takes. Example of conscious competence, it would be a young child riding a bicycle after practicing it. Not perfectly, not even perhaps very well, if the child is 7 or 8 years old, but he's practiced and now he can ride it. So he's competent enough to ride safely, and he's conscious of that. But he has to think about everything that he's doing. Another example could be an adult saying no when it's healthy to refuse, or a teenager being asked to take drugs or do something that would be harmful, and the teenager saying no. but it will take some effort to do that. It doesn't just become automatic. And then the last level is unconscious competence. Here, no effort is required because you've been doing it long enough and well enough, it's become automatic. You're just good at it without having to think about it. An example would be riding a bike or driving a car after years of doing it. You don't think about it, you just do it automatically without effort. Another example, more apropos to the road rage incident that I described earlier, would be where you get to the point by working at it for years that no one can upset you. You're just cool and calm all the time. And regardless of what anybody says to you, especially a stranger or insulting you, it just would have no reaction at all. And you go through life without negative feelings that you have to feel you have to act on. Speaking of impulse control, you may have heard of the marshmallow experiment. The marshmallow experiment was done on very young children, about 5 years of age. And the psychologist had the child in a room by himself, and the child's parents and the other experimenters could see through a one-way looking glass. The child didn't know that he was being watched. So the psychologist who was with the child said, I'm going to put a marshmallow here, and you can have it now if you want to, or I'm going to leave the room for a few minutes. If the marshmallow is still there, when I come back, I'll give you a second marshmallow. Then you'll have two. And then the psychologist left. And I've seen the videos of this experiment, and perhaps you have too. And every child wanted that marshmallow. It just looked so yummy. And some of them took it very quickly, as soon as the psychologist left. But and others really tried hard not to take it, so they would get two. And some of them succeeded, and they succeeded most easily if they distracted themselves. Some of them sang a little song. Some of them looked away. Some of them hummed to themselves, rather than just staring at the marshmallow all the time. And if they lasted the 5 minutes, these psychologists came back and gave them a second marshmallow. So they showed really good impulse control. They were willing to wait. They were willing to not just fall victim to their first desires or their first thoughts. And then, if you know about the experiment, you'll know that they follow those children through elementary school and into secondary school. And they found that when they were teenagers in high school, they were more competent. They were better adjusted than the children who had just grabbed the marshmallow when it was offered, or they perhaps took it after 30 seconds or 40 seconds. They just couldn't hold out to wait for the big reward of the second marshmallow. So they were able to control their impulses, unlike the mother in the car, who could not control her impulse to give an obscene gesture at the person who cut them off. And unlike the shooter, who had no impulse control and shot the one bullet into the trunk, and it cost the life of that little boy, 6 years old. So the question you might want to ask yourself is, what level are you at when it comes to impulse control? When it comes to being able to use the space between the events that happen to you and the response you give to those events. Are you at a unconscious incompetence, conscious incompetence, conscious competence, or an unconscious competence?